The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. This is Gone By Lunchtime. My name is Toby Manhire. Beside me I have the radiant personalities of Annabelle Lee from the Hui.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. And Ben Thomas from Exceltium. Kia ora.
Hello.
You had some feedback from someone's flatmate that I think in summary you said that Annabelle was a bit too quiet. I was too loud, or you
too much of you? I think
I surmised. I think the criticism was that sometimes it was difficult to hear because our voices project at different levels.
Yeah.
So I think Annabelle perhaps too quiet, not too quiet, just quiet. You maybe just far too loud and overbearing. What I took from it was that I was pitched just right.
Very much.
Maybe it was kind of
the kind of Goldilocks podcast.
Yeah, we should sort of aspire to. As a real centrist in all respects.
Centrist dad, Ben Thomas. We have a lot to get through, listeners. But first of all, we need to talk about Adrian's baby, don't we? Our friend and colleague, Adrian Stevenon has had his third.
Formerly of Young McDonald's Entertainers.
Oh, that's so true. And
via the Hui.
We've already had a message of enthusiasm from the newborn, but he doesn't have a name yet.
He doesn't have a name yet.
It was maybe McDonald, if may have given the entertainer.
McDonald's is nice. I would quite like something that plays off Neve, so I'm thinking Nova.
What about Neville? Neville. That's what I'd like to call, because I think it's a very funny joke to call Jacinda Ardern and Clark Gayford's baby Neville.
Cute, yeah, funny. Let's actually call his baby Neville.
All right. Ben, any Benjamin?
No, I think the offering up a name in the spirit of Ratana. I think that as now that we're in the era ushered in by the Prime Minister of Gen X tribute baby names, Neve was clearly named after Neve Campbell.
Yes.
The 90s screen siren.
Party of Five.
Yeah, Party of Five. I thought Bailey or Charlie would be a good name for Adrian's kid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you've got a selection there. One of those, please, and we'll be happy to announce that at the next Gone By Lunchtime podcast. Simon Bridges has been... You're right, Annabelle. Oh, my God. Annabelle is...
I don't know what's going on. Sorry, you're going to have to
not
that out.
quite just coughing fit.
Who's the Minister of Health now?
David Clark.
I feel like
also, and Alice, who may or may not cut out the coughing fit of Annabelle Lee, probably won't. Thank you again for helping us create this singular podcast. It was like, I sort of feel like it was with all of the shit that's going on in Australia as they go through their usual hellscape of spill and leadership change and backstabbing. It felt like New Zealand as a kind of smaller sibling was like, we got to have a scandal too, but it's the shittiest scandal of all time. Basically, Simon Bridges' expenses information, specifically how much he'd spent on his chauffeur-driven car, BMW. Limo is a bit again, a bit like, it's not really a limo, is it? When you say limo, people imagine this kind of stretched beast that's pulling up outside the Hilton, but it's really just a flash. It's just a nice sedan.
Yeah, they're
right?
BMWs. They're quite spacious.
They're nice.
4-seater cars.
Does it have like a drinks fridge?
No.
Oh,
No, there's no spa pool.
Occasionally, you'll have a driver who'll have some, water bottles and mints.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Mints.
That depends on the driver.
Like after
though.
dinner mints, like
That's
chocolatey
really-
mints, or like Oddfellow,
Like after, like
curiously strong.
Sometimes I've actually seen both.
It was about $110,000 or something that Simon Bridges had spent doing his tiki tour, meeting and greeting the people and the real hardworking
Simon
New
Says
Zealanders up and down the country. Yada yada yada. Pretty reasonable, uncontroversial activity for a leader of the opposition. The information was going to come out 2 days later anyway, in what most polities would be a fairly quotidian leak, turned into a massive firestorm, and then it was the big search for the leaker. Trevor Mallard, the Speaker of the House, announced that a QC would undertake it. National Caucus agreed to serve up their computers for a forensic analyst to dive through and find that it was all just kind of lost way a bit. And then it kind of, in the coda, went a bit haywire when an anonymous text was sent from a burner phone, which ostensibly...
A tribute to 90s hit Scream.
Wasn't Neve Campbell in that too?
Just join the dots, everybody.
Oh my goodness. This is you are listeners. This is like watching Miss Marple at work, right here.
I think now's a good time to announce our rebrand as a true crime podcast, determined to get to the bottom of the leaking scandal.
Wow, this is the new series of Serial. Where was I? Can I do my
The anonymous deranged texts were received. With the anonymous texter claiming to be the leaker and also claiming to be buckling under the strain of mental health issues and the pressure created by the inquiry, and strongly suggesting that there was a danger to themselves if the inquiry continued and they were uncovered. These texts were received by the Speaker Trevor Mallard, by the opposition leader Simon Bridges, and by Tova O'Brien, who was the reporter who broke the story of the leak in the first place. Bridges called a press conference on Friday morning, said that he had been in touch with the police because of the potential threat to this person. The police then investigated, told Bridges that they had found who the person was, that they weren't at liberty to tell him who it was for totally understandable reasons, because they were approaching this as a potential, health, safety issue, not as part of a criminal investigation. The police don't investigate leaks. And then there was a suggestion that because the texter also made reference to conversations or issues that they claimed only a part of someone who was a National Party MP and caucus would know. Now, based on that claim, Trevor Mallard called off the inquiry and leaving Simon Bridges in quite an unenviable position of now having a dominant media narrative that he has some loose unit national MP, that nobody knows the identity of at loose in his caucus, possibly not getting the help they need for their mental health issues, if those are true. And everyone just assuming that it's someone in the National Caucus, even though National now dispute that, those details were particularly sort of reserved for caucus members.
Although in that press conference, Simon Bridges certainly gave the impression that he believed it was someone in his... I mean, it was kind of weird in that he gave the impression that it was someone in his caucus, they accepted that likelihood of that. And then Jerry Brownlee came out later stomping his feet and all that, and said that was the Prime Minister had nudged the Speaker into calling off the inquiry.
Yeah, so that morning, the Prime Minister had said publicly that she thought it was an internal National Party matter, and that because of the spectre of mental health issues being raised, she thought the inquiry should be called off. She said that publicly. The Speaker then called it off, and then he later said that he had discussed the matter with the Prime Minister and with the opposition leader before he publicly called off the meeting. Now, National have started asking questions about what exactly was discussed with the Prime Minister. The Speaker and the Prime Minister say that it was just a heads up that he was calling off the inquiry, just the same as he gave to Simon Bridges. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that, even if the Speaker was acting sort of in what he believed the Prime Minister's interests or wishes were, the way that you do that is you don't have direct discussions with people and receive orders. It's more a sort of reading the tea leaves kind of matter.
I mean, I think Mallard suggested that he was really just informing them rather than seeking their counsel.
That's right, yeah.
What do you make of it all, Annabelle Lee?
It's pretty messy, isn't it? It's literally making a mountain out of a molehill, given that it was going to become public knowledge within a couple of days anyway. I feel like Simon Bridges has really emasculated himself through this process, and I feel like when the text came, that was an opportunity for him to claw back control of what had happened, and instead he persevered with his call for the inquiry to continue, and literally within hours the rug got ripped out from underneath him again. I don't understand why you would call for an inquiry in the first place if you weren't certain that the leak hadn't come from within your camp, because you're really then sort of disempowered, because you lose complete control of the process and the narrative, and you're just being kept abreast like a bystander. Whereas I think that once the leak was sort of revealed themselves at that point, he should have said, okay, this is a National Party matter and we'll be dealing with it internally. You could have continued with the same QC or have done what he's doing now, which is calling in PwC and who's the other group that he's got Simpson Grierson.
Yeah.
So why I'm not sure if he's been poorly advised or if these decisions are being made in the heat of the moment, but I just think that he has done himself no favours in the way he's managed this.
I mean, clearly it plays into a more long-standing tension between the opposition especially and the Speaker of the House, doesn't it? And that the reason that they were keen on the inquiry, one of the reasons that Mallard did call the inquiry because that he felt that his integrity had been impugned.
That's right, because the people who had access to the information, as far as we can tell, were the members of the Parliamentary Service, that's the staff under Trevor Mallard, Speaker's Office, Mallard himself and his staff, and apparently every member of the National Party caucus. So even if all of these individuals have an equal likelihood of being the leaker, the chance, the odds are way heavily in favour of it being part of the National Party. But because that question had been raised and because Parliamentary Services has to be seen to be sort of unimpeachable, Mallard called this inquiry. Then he called it off based on the texts that were received. And where National are angry here seems to be that they are saying he couldn't conclude what he concluded, i.e. it's almost certainly a National Party MP from the texts that were that they received. So I think their arguments there are that whatever was expressed in the texts as being sort of secret National Party information, wasn't. It could have been easily known.
It was information. Well, I mean, it was purportedly the way it was explained in the RNZ report originally, and I think by Tover O'Brien later, as material that you would only have that was drawn from National Party caucus meetings.
Yeah, that's right. But on the other hand, look, there's leaks are endemic. This is partially why National went wrong in the first place. Leaks are just a fact of life in Parliament. Leaks are very different from the theft of, private information. Leaks are where somebody properly has information and then they they use it, for a different purpose to that which it was intended. Every time you read a newspaper story about politics and the gallery reporter writes, "It is understood," or that means there's been a leak. Right.
Well,
it means that they were told off the record
briefing,
about. They were told off the record about something
different
that.
to a briefing, but yeah.
Not in all cases. I mean, it's very much in the same vein.
Yeah.
And you really should just deal with these things and move on. National should have explained the substantive issues, which were it's actually more expensive to not take a Crown car. These Crown car costs are largely illusory. They're just accounting balances, that get shifted from one government account to another. The cars, the drivers, the depreciation is all paid for. And then it's just a different way. They just apportion the costs out, through the year through internal accounting. So it doesn't cost the taxpayer any more, except maybe for a bit more fuel. That Simon Bridges supposedly racked up $85,000, in limo charges. Right? It would have been more expensive if he had hired a car because that would have been an additional cost to those costs that were already incurred. But instead of going out and just making that case basically on the facts, we called for an inquiry. Which you've got to be careful about. The last government got into a lot of trouble doing this. They called for inquiries into the leak of a GCSB security report, which led to the resignation of Peter Dunn, which meant that the government couldn't advance a lot of important legislation that year. They called for an inquiry into leaks of MFAT papers, which caused huge disruption in the civil service. A lot of people being moved around, loss of trust in departments. So it is best to move on from these things, but. I guess their principal concern is that they still don't know, who actually was the texter. Does the texter actually have mental health issues, or was that a false flag just to dissuade? It would be impossible to tell the two things apart. According to David Farrer's Kiwi blog, the texter sounded like they were a millennial. So suddenly Chloe Swarbrick's in the frame, Simeon Brown is under the gun.
What do you think that does sound like a millennial, or particularly through Farrer's gaze? What is that like? Does that mean it had lol in it, or does that mean it's got several emojis? Because Helen Clark uses emojis.
It would have had like TBH. I've not been feeling well. Yeah.
OTOH. I could meet you behind the beehive for it.
And finally, like the thing is, the inquiry probably wouldn't have revealed anything anyway. Only the most amateur, unless the leaker got this information and on their email and then just forwarded it to Tova O'Brien at NewsHub, there won't be any record of the leak. If they took a photo on their phone and then gave it to her, if they printed it out and then gave it to her, they just say, "Oh, I printed it out to read on the plane," whatever. You don't. There's no way. These inquiries never actually reach a satisfactory conclusion.
Although the fact of the text suggests that it was going to be the fact of that text, unless it's something completely, bizarre, suggests that the leaker expected that they would be found during the course of that inquiry, doesn't it?
Again, I don't think you should read too much into anonymous texts that are sort of pleading special circumstances. You can't.
Although the police didn't say that, from what was said in the statements, it sounds like the police believe that whoever wrote the text was the leaker.
Yeah, and
that person
and Tova seems
had was. Would be strong enough to be the subject of an inquiry. The police didn't say that they thought they were two different people, did they?
No, and Tova O'Brien seemed to confirm that the texter was the leaker. So I guess what's just in question is were they a national MP? But I think the best thing for this, the best thing for National here is just to move on and forget it ever happened. Now they've announced their inquiry with PwC. I'm not sure what it's going to achieve. Probably a $50,000 colourful PowerPoint presentation summarising what's been discussed.
It's good that PwC will, get a little bit of lucre out of it. That's the main thing.
Just speaking of Tova, I've seen the criticism made on Twitter when Tova rightly asked Simon Bridges if it was callous to continue with an inquiry when someone has expressed that they are suffering from mental health issues, that Tova shouldn't have run that story in the first place. And I just wanted to say as a journalist that I don't agree. And firstly, we shouldn't assume that Tova knew who the identity of the leak was in the first place. She may have been sent an anonymous email or whatever. And secondly, that even if she does know or did know who the identity of the leaker was, that doesn't necessarily mean that she also knows whether or not they're in a good frame of mind.
Interesting as well, Tova O'Brien she received the text and chose not to report it, and then RNZ got wind of it and chose to report it. And, there are all sorts of different questions about the ethics of doing that. I mean, I think in all cases defensible. The other one thing that just struck me about it is that it now makes it practically impossible, certainly difficult for any National MP to resign and then before the next election.
Right.
Yeah. Like if you were sort of thinking, I'm just going to, because there are a few, for example, we won't mention any names for fear of giving the wrong impression, but who might have been looking at the possibility of retirement and indeed might have been being encouraged by the leadership to think about retirement in order to bring a bit of fresh blood through. But now, you're not going to be throwing your hand up to do that for fear that you might in turn be cast as the millennial burner phone texter.
It's a funny thing. I feel like the leaks in Hollow Men were far worse, and yet there was almost less of a kerfuffle over it, wasn't there? And that was some really, heavy stuff that was getting leaked out of that. Just in terms of Simon Bridges, I saw a commentary by Heather Duplessis-Allen saying that he's probably the master of his own demise, and although he may not go in the next week or month or even year, that he will go. I think certainly the knives will be getting sharpened, the hangi stones will be getting heated up. But I do think that he is able to come back from this. But I think he needs to be better at telling his own backstory. This is a guy who is the youngest of 6 kids, grew up in a working class whānau in Te Atatu, was able to get himself all the way to Oxford. He's a bit of a Kiwi battler, Simon, but I think he comes across as the guy who thought he was going to be head prefect and missed out, and he's been tantruming about it ever since. And I think he needs to do what Helen Clark did and sort of go for a brand refresh and just become a more approachable guy, the Kiwi battler rather than the kind of prattish prefect that he sort of comes across as now.
Free political advice there for Simon Bridges. That is really valuable stuff. Ben Thomas would charge you $400 an hour for that.
I'll give that to you for free, bro.
That's nothing. We thought we might get a few more people into our podcast. We might get Simon Bridges in, come and chat to us.
Cool.
We can give him some more advice. Do a Dragon's Den on him.
If the leaker wants to come on, we could do a phoner.
We're happy to do a phoner with the leaker, and we will include. We can do everything. We can change your voice so that you sound exactly like Neve Campbell. We can do that, Alice? Yeah, no trouble. It's fine. Should we move on to? Got a call coming in there.
That's my 18-year-old trying to get hold of me.
Bring your 18-year-old.
Just
That's why Mihi Rose. She's not been up here the last couple of times.
No, she's actually been asked to become a part of caucus. She's going to be Lisa Owen's understudy for caucus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They've got a couple of years to train her up.
Clare Curran has been sacked.
R.I.P.
Sort of. She's the first sacking from the Jacinda Ardern cabinet.
Well, from the cabinet.
Well, that's a fact.
Yeah.
But fortunately for New Zealand journalism, she retains her role as the saviour of broadcasting and journalism in New Zealand. Is that her official title, or is that just
this is another example, I think, of how governments lose touch with the ordinary people and only look out for the interests of the elites. Because Jacinda Ardern has solved her problem of having to put up with Clare Curran in cabinet, but she hasn't done anything for everybody working in the broadcasting sector in New Zealand.
the ordinary hard-working people of New Zealand broadcasting.
Does Clare have leaks in her office? People leaking in her office, is that how come these meetings end up finding their way into Melissa Lee's inbox?
What we understand about that, I was leaked, is that it came up during the due diligence in the recruitment of this guy, Derek Handley, for the Chief Technology Officer role in the government, which is what
Derek Handley,
she met him about.
Who's the man from the future circa 1996, is how I think of him.
Yeah, he's a visionary. He's a visionary. Claire's a visionary. They got together.
You can imagine in the meeting in the Beehive, the secret meeting in the Beehive, which was the reason for the sacking of all portfolios except for broadcasting and ACC.
The two complete nothing portfolios.
It was the open government.
Open
Minister
government.
for Open Government.
And it's quite funny because she's the most transparent government promiser ever, and of course it was announced at 4 o'clock on a Friday when all of New Zealand media is at the pub.
Yes, after the Prime Minister had known for a week.
But the idea of this clandestine meeting at the top, and I think probably they were talking a lot about thinkfluencing. I think there was probably a lot of discussion about thinkfluencing during that.
What was Daniel McLaughlin tweeted when Curran, when the Hirschfeld meeting, which was, of course, her first undisclosed secret meeting, came to light earlier this year. People were talking all conspiratorially, and Daniel said, I feel sorry for it. Carol probably tried to talk a bit about radio in New Zealand, and Clare Curran lectured her on Chomsky for half an hour.
Annabelle.
I think she was lucky to survive the first time around. And I think she's been lucky to survive again. I wonder if it's a decision that was made because, it's such a narrow margin between the Nats and Labour that they felt like they couldn't really afford to have a disgruntled MP within the ranks. But I just don't understand why you'd be allowed to keep any portfolios after that, especially broadcasting, because when you're responsible for RNZ, being also translucent and not having any perception of political interference or that sort of thing. Seems unusual that she'd be allowed to keep that portfolio.
And you're right that it's the second offence is pretty close in its characteristics to the first offence.
It is, but you also have to question why, if he was part of a recruitment process, he was wanting to have meetings with her anyway. To me, it seems a little bit inappropriate.
We don't know about that. And I mean, the Prime Minister was quick to kind of absolve Handley of any responsibility in all this, because really when you apply for a job, no matter what discussions you have, you shouldn't have any expectation that's going to become public, I mean, that's but the fact that a Minister of the Crown is having discussions about a meeting that goes undiarised over her private Gmail account, I mean, not to get all Hillary Clinton on it, but her emails,
Oh, look, absolutely. And the thing is, failing to diarise meetings is not a problem, right? There's no, you don't. I don't think you have to record it. Maybe under the Public Records Act, you might at a stretch. You do have to answer parliamentary questions accurately.
Yeah.
But then, of course, a number of ministers haven't answered them accurately, and they've gotten tickings off from the Speaker. What's really at issue here is whether the Prime Minister can have confidence in Clare Curran to carry on any kind of policy program and perform as a minister in any capacity without sort of tripping over the carpet, like landing on a stove element, falling backwards down a stairwell, trying to steady herself and falling into a laundry chute and rolling into a highway or something. And she cannot. She 100% can't have any confidence that the rolling infinite loop of Clare Curran fuck-ups will ever stop, or even pause for a moment.
So why is she... I mean, is Annabelle right then that she retains broadcasting for fear that she will start a backbench factional revolt from...
I mean, there's a few theories. One is that Labour is not flush with funds. They got a lot of money in for the election, but they spent it. Labour doesn't like fighting by-elections, especially in a safe seat, because it's just money down the drain.
Oh, you mean she would quit if she lost that?
Well, you never know. I mean, she's been hanging around for a long time. She probably, you tend not to want to hang around too much longer as a backbencher if you're sacked as a minister. The idea of you don't want disgruntled people. Gender balance is probably an issue. I think that's the only thing that stopped Chris Farfoy from being immediately promoted into cabinet, because that would throw out the percentages. The least credible theory that I've heard was one advanced by Jane Patterson of Radio New Zealand this week, which was that Curran was needed to stay on the broadcasting portfolio to see through complex and sensitive policy. I'm making a broadcasting standards complaint about that just, you can't go on air and lie to the people of New Zealand and get them to try and swallow something like that.
It's a completely defensible and reasonable position from Jane Patterson, political editor of Radio New Zealand, and I apologise for that appalling defamation on the part of Ben Thomas. Shall we move on from Clare Curran? Is there anything else to say about Clare Curran? Good. Also, Claire, you're welcome in here to our podcast. And we'd just like to remind the leaker.
We'll record it at 10 o'clock
0800
in your office.
Leaks are
in
us. Parliament.
We don't need to.
Well, Astoria. We'll do it at Astoria.
Don't diarise. We won't send you a calendar.
We won't tell anyone. We won't tell anyone. The leaker will be there. Claire will be there. 3 of us will be there. Adrian's new baby will be there. It's going to be special. Jacinda Ardern this week gave what was trailed as a major speech. You knew it was a major speech because it kept on being gazetted as a major speech, and it was to the business community, as it's described, and it was quite explicitly designed to mollify the business titans of New Zealand over their confidence. And everyone has been making comparisons to the winter of discontent in the early 2000s, when Helen Clark and Michael Cullen did a similar exercise and held a summit to try and get business back on side and clarify what they were hoping to achieve, blah, blah, blah. And the big announcement on Tuesday morning was the creation of a business advisory council, which is very important because finally big business has an opportunity to be heard, because previously it was very hard for people in big business to have their opinions heard in the halls of power, and the beehive was very difficult for them to use their extensive networks of lobbyists and personal contacts to have their views heard. Do you criticise for yet another working group? It's not a working group, but it does still.
It's a permanent advisory group.
It's a permanent
channel, a stint.
It's a body.
It's
another body.
Injected into the body politic to allow business views through.
Was this a cynical act? Was it a sensible bit of symbolism? What do you reckon, Annabelle?
I think she had to be seen to do something. So I don't think it's a bad idea. What annoys me is just how much stock New Zealand seems to put in business confidence. It seems like, we care more about how business is feeling than some of our lowest paid, most disenfranchised workers. I hope she talks to them about important business issues like the price of avocados and how it's stopping us from buying houses and stuff.
It is important though, right? Business is, that's that
business is important, going. But it feels like we get held to ransom.
If they're feeling sad,
someone said that. Someone said recently, the difference between Labour and National is that National actually delivers to its support base, and I think while it's a good idea and obviously something needs to be done to signal that the government does take its relationship with business serious, I think it's also important too that Labour's not seen to be selling out on its support base to scrape and bow to these business folks who are feeling a little bit blue about, perhaps having to pay people a living wage and stuff.
It does. David McLean said in introducing Jacinda Ardern at the breakfast, that's the boss of Westpac, said that business should just get over it, and that they're obviously all basically, to paraphrase, that they were all grumpy because their team didn't win, and they didn't expect their team not to win. But in a way, maybe the team themselves didn't expect to win either, and that's why they have to do things like create advisory councils.
That's true.
Yeah, and look, I think that's right. They shouldn't overstate the threat of this government to business. You know, some of the employer groups are launching a campaign against the proposed employment law reforms, and that's fine. That's their core business. They want to do that to protect the small and medium-sized businesses who belong to them. But the world won't end. At most we'll go back to a 2008 position under the Employment Relations Act. So it's these things aren't cataclysmic. Where the real uncertainty comes in is things like the decision on oil and gas exploration and the fair pay agreements, that Jacinda Ardern, to sort of mollify the audience, said there'd only be one or two of these things which set pay rates nationally.
Yeah, that was disappointing.
For industries. Well, I think she'll be struggling to even get one or two in place. Jim Bolger's leading a working group, of course, on this, and in order for that to actually, as far as anyone can tell, the government actually has no idea what these things will look like or how they'll work, because you have to take into account, how somebody, say an engineer in a Southland, small town, will have the same minimum pay rate as an engineer in Auckland with all the living costs that entails. So I don't think anyone has got a good idea on how these things are actually going to work in practice. That'll need a lot of ironing out. Then you've got to pass legislation. Then you've actually got to negotiate one of these things for the first time. So I don't see any prospect that any of them will be in place by the election. But that does create uncertainty for employers. But I think you're right. It's largely overstated, and it's becoming a bit of a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. In terms of another advisory group, I mean, there's a question about how many new ideas it will introduce. The only member who's been named is Chris Luxon from Air New Zealand. Now, whenever you listen to an economic speech by Jacinda Ardern or the Finance Minister Grant Robertson, the only company they ever mention is Air New Zealand, because Air New Zealand have got this kind of tripartite, as it was called under the previous Labour government, approach where they sort of get the unions and the employer and they work together with government. That's a bit easier for them because they're 50% owned by the government.
Yeah.
That's right, there's a sell down there. 50% owned by the government. They're a legacy monopoly, effectively in New Zealand, which many of our big companies are. So actually the concerns that these
got
big...
the Sky Couch. That's another thing.
Oh, look, and they're a good airline. They've performed well. But I don't think they'll be getting many new ideas that they didn't have before by talking to Chris Luxon, or in fact by talking to any of these, the big companies in New Zealand, which tend to be sort of legacy, former monopolies, who are actually acting in a very different business environment from small and medium enterprises, who are the ones who are feeling a bit gloomy. But on the other hand, they probably do need to get over it a little bit.
Just in terms of the whole working group thing too, actually National had plenty of working groups, and one that springs to mind is the one that did the review of SIFs, which didn't feature any Māori in it and was led by Paula Rebstock, who as far as I know doesn't have a background in anything to do with social welfare or children or anything Māori. So, people get annoyed with all the working groups. I don't necessarily think that they're a bad thing, that they are a bad thing, but, the proof will be in the pudding.
It's certainly going to be interesting in the lead up to 2020 because lots of there are a lot of them, whether or not they're a good or a bad thing or whatever. There's going to be a lot of policy formulated towards the end of the term, and it's going to be we always say we want elections fought on ideas and different programs. It's going to be all laid out there. Wayne Mapp, former Minister of the Crown, former National MP, and sometime spin-off columnist, wrote an interesting piece to that end on thespinoff.co.nz recently, which I think is true. I mean, I don't think it's a kind of secret plot, but it is all going to lead up from the tax working group down to in 2020. It's 3 years is a long time to write a manifesto, arguably, but it's all going to be laid out, and that's cool. That's how it's meant to work, right? People in an election get to decide whether or not that's what they want.
Yeah, and that might not be a bad time for it. I mean, with New Zealand First probably a little to the right in traditional terms to Labour, the Greens to the left. there is a bit of a break there. It does become difficult for Labour to make radical changes. So it could be that an election where we get a chance to reset, the percentages in Parliament is actually a good time to take all of those ideas to the electorate rather than having them sort of hashed out in back rooms with kind of trade-offs and deals.
Oh, we haven't. Well, speaking of that, we haven't talked about. We should touch briefly on the fact that TOP isn't dead after all. The Opportunities Party has returned with Jeff Simmons.
It's
now
brand
the leader.
new and fresh, which is to say exactly the same.
Do they have a shit show? Is there any outside chance that they? I mean, it's a hell of an ask to get 5%. There's not going to be an electorate deal because there really isn't even an electorate that National could do a deal with them on, unless you thought Wellington Central. But even then, that probably wouldn't be enough. Do they have a chance of getting 5%, or is that dreamland?
I think they've really got to narrow their focus. They have such a sort of hodgepodge of different policies. Entrenched Māori upper house, comprehensive asset tax, killing cats. They,
God,
stuff
I like
that's sort
all
of
of that
all
stuff.
over the
I would
place.
vote. I think I'm going to vote for them.
Would you be interested in standing for them?
Maybe.
Okay,
Probably
right.
they're looking for a new deputy leader.
Well, I think we could announce that now.
Yeah.
Which electorate are you going to stand in, Annabelle?
I'd like. There was no new Māori seats that came out of the roll option, was there?
No.
I'd like my own special seat.
You want your own seat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good top thinking outside the box.
Rangi Mataro, which is the
Blue sky thinking
Māori
is a Google
electorate
Ray.
in Point Chevalier.
Uh-huh.
You'd vote for me, right?
Yes.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Toby.
I would do that.
I'm going to make you my campaign manager.
Okay, I can. I'll be Sean Plunkett 2.0. You wanted to talk about Chelsea. I've got Chelsea Manning written down here.
Oh, I don't know. It just
Do you want to talk about that?
Not really. I mean, it's kind of boring, but it just shows all of these free speech arguments always just turn into what people prefer. It's always the people I like should have free speech, the people I don't like shouldn't. So everyone's flipped their roles from the Lauren Southern Stephen Molyneux debacle.
When you say everyone, do you mean your Twitter feed?
Yeah.
I need to get off Twitter.
Yeah,
it's hurting my brain.
Let's talk about that. That's more interesting than talking about Chelsea Manning and whether or not she should be allowed to speak. You quit Twitter for a while.
I
then you came back, and now you're still back.
At the beginning of the week, I quit. Beginning of the year, I quit, and then I took a week off.
Okay.
The other week.
Okay.
So you actually start to
This is a
feel your
detox.
brain regrowing.
Yes.
In your skull, like your body healing itself.
Oh, I see. When you're off it, you
Yeah,
feel
of all
it.
the
Right,
terrible
right,
opinions and just garbage views. Yeah.
And that's just your drafts folder. Criminal Justice Summit was held last week in Porirua. And it was a big sort of, I suppose, milestone thing that Andrew Little, who is attempting to overhaul criminal justice laws in New Zealand, one of his overarching ambitions is to sort of take head on this idea, the tough on crime mantra, that kind of default position, to send a message including to those of us who work in the accursed media. Did you pay a lot of attention to it, Annabelle?
I didn't attend myself, but I've read some interesting articles and heard some interviews about it, one particularly by Aaron Small, who wrote a piece for the spin-off. Smale. That's what I said.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. Saying that he felt like that the Māori male voice was missing from it, which presumably would be probably the most important voice to have in the room, given that it's our men who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, although apparently the women's prison population, over 60% are Māori women. So, that criticism has come from Prue Kapua, who is president of the Māori Women's Welfare League and the wife of Lewis Awal. So I think having a criminal justice, having a justice summit is a great thing. Probably something that's long overdue. It's just a real shame that seems as though the voice of Māori have been overlooked, and that perhaps we need to have our own separate Justice Summit.
That was one of the suggestions, wasn't it? That there is and Moana Jackson is getting towards the finish line on the kind of sequel to the report that came out in, when was the big report?
Can't remember.
I think it was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 87, was it?
So that's coming up later in the year, and it feels like that will be a really interesting in terms of what he and his team recommend. I think they're not making recommendations per se, but what comes out of that report, and because basically the kind of inescapable bottom line of it is that since that first report came out, almost nothing's changed, except that there are now more Māori women in jail. Otherwise, it's basically nothing's changed.
I feel too like, I mean, not that I'm an expert in this area, but apparently one of the sort of gateway crimes into jail is are car offences, driving without licences, those sorts of things. So, you know, those are that's something that could be quite easily addressed within the education system if you get kids, you know, sitting their licences at school and that becomes a part of the curriculum. You know, I'm sure there's some very complex solutions and probably some quite simple ones as well.
Among the other challenges is the reality that the coalition government has one constituent part that is squarely in the tough on crime space. You know, the three strikes, Andrew Little wanted to strike out the three strikes law, the three strikes rule, and he was quite publicly embarrassed by Mr. Peters and the New Zealand First Party when he had to jettison that a couple of months back. Ben.
Yeah, and ultimately that's, you know, well, ultimately what's going to bring down the prison population is better social services, better education, better wraparound care for at-risk youth. The only thing that can do it in the short term is changing the bail and sentencing laws, and that's going to meet a lot of resistance from Winston Peters. It'll meet a lot of resistance from the public. I think, you know, Little's office is very aware of that. They're aware of the fact that they have to, you know, bring the public with them on this journey, to use sort of John Mitchell or Steve Hansen talk. And I guess the Justice Summit was sort of the first part of that, about, you know, starting this wider conversation. But it is going to have to get a lot more specific. You know, you're not going to be able to overhaul the whole justice sector as one thing, or as, you know, a big meeting of 600 people in one hall. So there's going to be breakouts about, is it Māori justice, and victims are going to have their own summit, and you know, because you're really covering everything. You're covering the family court, which is disputes about custody, down to preventative detention, down to sentencing, down to, you know, it's and a lot of these things aren't connected, and the people don't, you know, sort of overlap. But you know, it's probably good to get people thinking about this in public. You know, it's the only way that people will sort of get away from, you know, the really sort of knee-jerk, you know, tougher sentencing means better crime policy position. And, you know, they've got a few years to do it.
There was also one of the kind of reported moments was when a woman whose name I forget, linked to the Sensible Sentencing Trust, stood and said that there was not enough focus on victims. And so, as well as this particular summit for Māori, there's been talk of a separate summit for victims, and there's so, I mean, there are obviously there's a working group as well that springs out of this, that this was the sort of launch pad for, and they'll go about their business and come back with recommendations. It's going to be a live subject for a good while yet.
Criminal justice will be a live subject forever in a democracy.
It's a lot of stuff to unfuck, to be fair.
You know, very quickly, we want to give a shout out to our other podcast family. What's your favourite in the
ladies at On the Rag? But although I'm
ladies.
really hurt that they did like a makeup tutorial,
Yes.
and I wasn't invited.
Sure, we haven't talked about your fantastic menstrual cup gags on Spin-Off TV.
I think we did.
That's the
last
best
time,
thing I've
didn't
seen on
we?
TV.
That was
I think.
pretty amazing. What was the
you,
metaphor?
I don't know.
Oh, don't shy.
What was it? Your
Project.
Your twat goblet, your Edward Cullen shot glass.
My Transylvanian teacup.
What about you, Ben? What's your favourite in the spin-off stable of podcasts?
I listen to On the Rag, but the Real Pod probably, and it's picking up now because the Australian Bachelor has just started screening on New Zealand TV.
When you say it's picking up now, was it lost a bit? Was it feeling a bit flat? Was it?
No, it's good, great podcast. But everything in my life feels better when the reality TV shaped hole in my heart is full.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. You can catch that weekdays at 10 a.m. That's Gone By Lunchtime. Bye.
Bye.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBit.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.